Okay, well, I guess we'll get started. It doesn't look like anyone's going to show up. Again, just come up in the other classes. My morning class was sort of a mess because it turned out they tried to assign our class to an office, which doesn't work very well. So if you're going to be in class versus continuing to Zoom, remember you're supposed to have that as an option in all the classes that you can either be or not be in terms of on campus. If you don't have it, because I bumped into a student this morning who was sort of distraught. She was trying to figure out where her class was. The instructor hadn't said anything one way or the other. Be sure and you ask your instructors. It's supposed to be an option that everyone has. You don't have to be here if you don't want to, but if you do want to be, the university is supposed to provide that access to your market. The instructor is supposed to provide that access one way or the other. Now, in some cases, they won't because of health issues, but they've got to tell you. So there's apparently a fair number of people wandering around as of this morning that instructors never told them anything. So in that case, take the initiative, email them, and get the word from them in terms of what's going on. Somewhere along the line, I don't know, maybe some people didn't get told. They've got to tell the students what they're up to. So just remember you have that option. I also had one student yesterday that was all worried because they were wondering if they had to be in class. No, you don't have to be on campus if you don't want to be on campus. So remember, you got two options. It's not a one size fits all scenario. So be aware that you can do either. If we're going to consistently not have anyone show up in class, and I'm probably going to go back and do it in the office since then everything works right. This is always sort of humbug to try to make it work here, but we'll try this. Okay, so let's get started. I'm trying to remember where I ended up last time. I ended up with the acid photochemical smog. When you're talking about, no, I think I ended up with biodiversity actually. When you're talking about things like biodiversity, you sort of end up in one of the side sort of tangents, or I should say the two topics run parallel, would be the idea that you have to have as much biological diversity as possible because that just benefits the planet in the longer term. What you also then have is the whole issue of preservation. At what point do you try to protect organisms or environments that are under siege or disappearing or whatever? And part of this you have to remember comes from peculiarly Western European mindset. Again, I think at the beginning of the semester I mentioned a little bit about this idea of bias. In the Judeo-Christian Islamic concept of the universe, there's a very clear idea that God made the world and everything in it, and then made man in his image. And so there's this whole sort of hierarchy then of God or the divine on one hand, underneath him is the human species, and underneath that is like everything else. It's important to remember that logic doesn't apply to other religions. That's a peculiarly West Asian concept. It originated in Judaism, moves to Christianity, and taken up in Islam, because they use the same religious text to a certain extent. And so once you move outside of that religious traditions, you don't see yourself in a perceptual universe, if you would, where people are in a position of dominance over the rest of the planet. In fact, for a large part of the world's population, people are just seen as one species, and they're not even seen as necessarily a particularly dominant species. For example, a Japanese society, a book I'm looking at on fox spirits, is very clear that even today in Japanese society, there's a very clear sense that certain types of animals or animal spirits, which use kami, but actually just animals themselves, including foxes, are actually considered smarter and more powerful than people are. So Japanese society doesn't have a concept where people are in a position of dominance or authority. Now, of course, the downside of that, you certainly see this in a lot of Asia, is that also means that people aren't in a sense of responsibility. So if people make a mess, like the Chinese make a mess of a lot of stuff, they don't see themselves as being morally or religiously responsible for protecting things. So among other things, if you go to China, you won't find there's no equivalent to the society, SPCA or Humane Society. There's no idea that people should protect animals. Eat them, yeah, but protect them, no. They just don't understand why that would be something that people are responsible for. The idea of a humane society is based on the idea that people are responsible for other animals. Think of Noah and the Ark being a classic case in point. That's a very Judeo-Christian Islamic concept, the idea that God tells Noah, Noah builds an ark, and Noah puts all the animals in the ark. So it's Noah's job. The Western concept of a zoo is very much the same thing. So when you're talking about preservation, you have to remember it comes from a very particular set of religiously based mindsets that people are in a position of superiority. Therefore, along with that superiority and the ability to make change, there's some sort of an obligation to protect the world around them. If you don't have that premise, if you don't have that religious background, then you can't have that discussion in the same way. And this is why when you talk about species preservation and even environment preservation, in a lot of other places, people look at you sort of blankly like, well, yeah, okay, I can understand why it's bad for people, but why do I care what happens to whatever? And that's very much within this idea of this different mindset. When you're talking about preservation, it gets, especially in American society, I think more so than even in Europe, it's really complicated also, because you have the various mindsets that somehow these are either reflective of technical specialties or bureaucracies. This also brings us into an area which actually I haven't covered, I don't think, and that would be what we call NGOs. These are a phenomenon of the late 20th century. NGO means non-governmental organization. If you go prior to the, well, we'll just say arbitrarily 1900s. If you go prior to, if you go back over 100 years, what you'll find is you pretty much had religious groups would talk about things, and or in the Euro-American context, and or governments would do stuff. But generally it was governments. And so those were the two groups that were responsible, but they all had sort of large agendas. They had a bunch of different things that they were bothered with. So if you go back to the early 20th century in the United States, the prohibition movement to make sure that people couldn't drink alcohol was a religiously based movement, but then it was pushed into government and it became government's job to make sure that people couldn't drink alcohol. So that would be this idea of sort of traditional logic, which is you get government to do it. In the last half of the 20th century, and maybe a little bit before, but certainly in the last half, another type of thing shows up. And this other type of thing is the idea of organizations or agencies which have one particular thing that they're concerned about. So they're sort of topic or theme specific. And initially they're found within countries. But very quickly with the increasing communications that you get, especially once the internet shows up, as they become global. So Greenpeace would be an example of this, Oxfam. There's a ton of different organizations which technically become called NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. Now, the one thing all these groups have in common is they have a specific thing they're worried about. So if you're Amnesty International, what you're specifically worried about is that due process be followed across the world for all human beings. And that's all you're interested in. Amnesty International is totally not interested in pollution, species extinction, or anything else. They're only interested in that. Greenpeace is interested in particular aspects of environmental preservation. They're not interested in other stuff. These are typical NGOs. Now, what has happened since the time you guys were in grade school is that whereas NGOs used to be sort of topic specific, but they weren't really very powerful. They depended on sort of public relations campaigns to get people upset. They really didn't have a lot of leverage. Once the internet starts to become a big thing, and especially social media becomes a big thing, what you find is NGOs very quickly realize that they can leverage that. So if you look right now, I'm not sure what's being dissed on right now, but I can guarantee there's at least 3 or 4 things that people are saying, well, you don't buy stuff from this company, or don't eat this particular food because this company's bad, or it's doing attitude, or it's not doing something that someone wants. And that particular agenda item would be an NGO. So NGOs are only interested in one particular thing, and they want to get something fixed the way they want it to be fixed. They become enormously powerful in the 21st century. They didn't exist 40 or 50 years ago. They're not part of governments because they're outside of governments, and they're oftentimes global, so they're not even country specific. When you deal with things like preservation, NGOs become on one hand a valuable commodity because they bring, shine the light on things that maybe people weren't thinking about. On the other hand, they can also be highly competitive because if you get one group that wants to save cats, and one group that wants to save turtles, and one group that wants to save the Ali crow or something like that, they can very much end up at cross purposes. And as you guys are well aware, I'm trying to figure out what cause you should support or what you should be worried about, you can just get swamped. There's just a million NGOs out there. There's a million folks with an agenda, and they all need to be done now. So this is the problem that governments have, is dealing with things like NGOs, which you know, were not as big an issue even when your parents were little. And certainly when your grandparents were around, these things didn't exist. These become a huge issue because what is one of the side effects of NGOs has been that preservation has become less and less of a discussion of environments and has become more and more discussion of small things. So what you get is preservation of a particular species of tree, preservation of a particular species of whale. But you don't end up with the larger discussions in many cases, which has to do with large-scale environmental impacts. I do not know of an NGO which, for example, specifically deals with climate change. But there's a bunch of NGOs that deal with stuff very specific, like the Surf Break Foundation here, which is worried about sea level rise because it's going to ruin surfing. And that's a good example of an NGO. But their approach to and what they want is so specific, it's sort of hard to figure out, to make those folks happy, what is it you're actually going to do that's going to, quote, fix that? And because they're focused on a single item, they're not interested if you say, well, you know, this is part of a complicated situation, you got to look at these other things. They're going to go, yeah, but we want this. So preservation has gotten inextricably tied up with NGO sort of agendas. And that makes it very complicated to deal with, because you frequently find, if you work in this area as I have, that in the process of doing one thing, you get other NGOs upset with you because you're not dealing with their thing. And you guys see this when you get involved with any of these, you know, sort of advocacy type situations, where in doing one, you can immediately find yourself, you know, sort of pissing off another one because, you know, we should have been first, if you want to think of it that way. One of the ways you sort of see this would actually be with the idea of garbage, especially here on Oahu. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with our green and blue and basically sort of green black bins. What's the blue bin? So you got three things. What do you throw in the blue bin here on Oahu?
Recyclables.
Okay, what type? You're right.
Cardboard. I do cardboard.
Yeah, cardboard and plastics, pretty much. What do you throw in the garbage bin? The regular one.
Trash.
That's sort of a trick question. Pretty much everything else, right? What do you throw in the green one, if you have the bright green one?
Plants and
Yeah, that was probably the most visually makes sense, right? Yeah. Now, originally when that program was set up, and this was based on several advocacy groups that were part of these NGOs, this was set up so that the green stuff would go and be turned into compost. So then it could be basically reused as fertilizers and basically for growing plants. The blue bin would be sorted out, and the glass and plastics would be sorted out and then sent to locations to be recycled. And then the paper would be then, you know, sorted out and then sent away to be recycled. This is so that you didn't waste that resource. Remember, idea of renewable and non-renewable resources. And the garbage one would be stuff that goes in the landfill because you don't know what else to do with it. Now, this was also tied in the period of time where they came up with the idea of power generation. So actually, I should include that in one of the other power sources would be biomass burning. So for example, the H power plant over in Kapolei is an example of a biomass plant. You take the stuff that you guys put in the dark bins, you throw it on a conveyor belt, it gets shoved into the big heating system there, and it gets burned up, and then it generates heat, and that spins turbines, which generates electric power. So the end result is you get rid of most of the stuff that you throw away gets turned into ash, which doesn't take up much space, and you end up generating energy. So that was a way to cut down on the amount that you put in landfills. In fact, now, no point showing you this, but if I remember, I'll show you what a landfill looks like in a second. If I can call that up now. So when you're looking at these, that would be the classic idea. Now the problem with these, while on one hand it makes perfect sense in the sense that it's a real logical thing. Does anyone have any idea where the paper went? So if you're in the blue bin and you work for the city and county of Honolulu, Does anyone know where they put the cardboard and newspaper and stuff that you guys threw away?
Yes, ma'am? Oh, no. Oh, not at all.
Sorry, I'm trying to type in something here.
Were you bringing it in the office or somewhere?
All that stuff went to China. So they put it in big barges and they tow it about 5,600, 6,000 miles to China, at which point then it's ground back up
Yes.
and turned into new cardboard, which then turns back into cardboard boxes.
Yes, I can check. And I know that the other one needs fruits.
Okay. Now, from an environmental standpoint, what's not particularly good about that? On one hand, you're recycling that cardboard.
It costs a lot.
Yeah, well, it costs a lot to do it. You're exactly right. You have to pay the guys in China to do it. They're not going to do it for free. And secondly, is you've got all the energy you're spending on the tugs, which are then taking the barge all the way to China. And of course, then the cardboard eventually gets shipped back here. So the amount of fossil or non-renewable energy you're using is actually quite high to recycle the renewable energy. And now something similar sort of happens to plastics. Well, say you guys suddenly decide that you're gonna quit drinking bottled water. So you take all your plastic water bottles and you throw that in the blue bin. What happens to that? It's just not specific to Hawaii, but it's actually true everywhere. What happens if you try to crush up plastic? Does plastic crush up very well? No, not really. It bounces back. You can get yourself a nice little bit of exercise bouncing up and down. The plastic's going to pretty much look the same. It'll be partially squashed and that's it. To actually turn that back into petrocarbon, in other words, to the same oil it originally came from, you have to use a lot of heat and pressure, which in most cases, ironically, means that you have to use another non-renewable resource to actually heat the plastic up, sort of melt it back into a semi-oil state. And then you can turn into a new piece of plastic. That's why you'll see bottles that say, 70% recycled plastic. You actually turn it back into plastic pellets, and then someone turns it back into a bottle somewhere. So again, you have to ship it thousands of miles, and because it doesn't compress very well, it's very hard to do this efficiently. Then you have to use energy to convert it back into plastic so that you can go buy the bottle at Whole Foods or something like that. Now, what's that tell you about the actual environmental costs of recycling the plastic?
It's too much for recycling to be like sustainable or effective.
Yeah, it actually, if you look at the carbon footprint, it costs about 3 or 4 times more in terms of energy cost to recycle the plastic than it would to just get rid of it. This is why about 7 years ago, the city and county started to run out of money. Like Peyton pointed out, it was costing money. City and county started to run out of money to pay for the recyclables. Back in the day when they originally came up with recycling, the attitude was the companies that did the recycling would pay you for the material. So the cost of oil was high enough that you'd pay people to bring in plastic and you'd actually make money turning it back into new plastics because it was cheaper than buying chunks of oil. The problem was the price of oil dropped dramatically. So now it's actually way more expensive to recycle plastic than it just is to suck more oil out of the ground. The same's true of paper. It's actually more expensive to recycle cardboard than it is to just, cut a tree and make new paper out of it. So the end result has been recycling only works when resources are expensive. If resources aren't expensive, then it becomes too costly. So for example, the stuff in your blue bins, now it doesn't get recycled at all. It gets sent down to the H-Power plant the same as your dark garbage bins. Because the city and county can't figure out how to make money out of it, so they just burn it at the incinerator because that's cheaper than any of the alternatives. So even though you guys might be very conscientious about recycling, it's not really doing what you're intending it to do because the city and county isn't following through with it. And to be logical from their standpoint, they can't because there's just not enough money in it. Let's take a look at how this plays out, though, especially on an island. you see one of the problems we have as an island. It's a classic example of this whole issue of garbage and landfills. You see this whole thing here. This is the High Point landfill. My company actually did the environmental assessment for this thing when they first put it in back in the 70s. This used to be a gulch that was actually deeper than this one here. So what you had was the hillsides went up about 300 feet. It went all the way back here. In fact, these are sort of mirrors of each other. And in the 70s, when we originally did the work for the city and county, it looked just about like this place here. In fact, they're sort of twins. And the attitude of the city and county back in the 70s when we did the work was, first they were asking us from the cultural standpoint, what were the impacts? And they weren't really too much. But they also, when we were talking to the engineers that were doing the work, is the attitude was it was going to take till about 2050 to fill this valley up with garbage. So when they opened up this particular dump in 1979, I think it was, and they opened up the landfill here, the attitude is it would be about half full right now, and it would take another 20 to 40 years for it to fill up completely. If you notice, the sucker is actually over full. So this here is actually higher than the ridge. So this whole valley here has been full out to the fact where it actually bulges up, which was never intentional. That wasn't supposed to happen. So right now this is actually illegal, but the city and county is doing it because they don't have any alternatives. We have managed on the island of Oahu to fill this entire valley up from bottom to top in roughly half the time it was supposed to take. Now, some of you mentioned when you're doing your reviews of the videos, your little reactions, how much we throw away. This is probably one of the classic examples, because the scary thing about this is 2/3 of this thing was filled up after the H-Power plant was put into operation. So even with the H-Power plant burning almost anything that could be burned, we have managed to fill this thing up in half the time it was supposed to take. That's the problem that you have everywhere. It's more critical on islands because right now they've been trying for the last 10 years to get somewhere on Oahu to accept another one of these. And no place on Oahu wants to do it. Who wants to have a garbage dump in their backyard? Especially because the population's increased and there's a lot more people in almost everywhere than there was, back in the 1970s. So one of the problems that we're facing right now, to a huge extent, is what do we do with the garbage? Basically, by 2023, I think it is, Oahu is going to have no space left for garbage. They're going to have no place to put it because this is already over full. The other landfills are all full, and they don't know what to do. They're already burning as much as they can at the H-Power plant down here. So they're just out of alternatives. They don't know what else they can possibly do except fill up another valley. And so this is actually, on one hand, this seems to be an island problem. But if you go to, images of garbage dumps on the mainland, you find that there are these absolutely enormous areas that are on the mainland that are exactly the same thing. It's just not as obvious on a mainland if you're someplace like Nevada and you got, millions of acres of open space. When you fill up and make a huge garbage dump, it doesn't seem to have the same impact because there's always a lot of other empty places around. And you can put it where it's not near people. But in an island, you actually get, this is a microcosm for the rest of the planet. At some points, you can't just dump stuff. You just don't have that option because at some point you're running out of space. This water down here is incredibly polluted. Not to mention the incredible smells that you get if you live down over here. So it's one of the huge problems is the amount of waste that we generate is so completely out of ratio, if you would, with the number of people that we have. And the amount of waste is not only increasing because we're increasing the amount of waste we generate. Despite all the concerns you have that everyone seems to have in 2020 about recycling, we're actually generating more waste than we were 10 years ago. It's not gone better. And you have so much of the world's population, especially in India and China, that have now moved into the middle class, so they're generating more waste than they were just because they've got more money and they buy more stuff. So as the world's population becomes more wealthy, the amount of waste being generated per person is sort of radically shooting up. So this problem is becoming an absolutely massive global problem. Is what do you do with landfills? Now, in some cases, you can actually look at them, and there's actually been sort of odd examples of how this works out in sort of a weird way. Here's Kakaka Waterfront Park, which right now is a source of a huge amount of hoo-hoo for the homeless living around there. But other than that, it's a landscaped area. Anyone know what was here prior to the landscaping? That was the city and county's dump. That was the first major urban dump in the island of Oahu. Everything was piled here. In fact, the shoreline used to be all the way back here. All of this is land that's basically nothing but garbage. It was filled up. In the 1940s or 1950s, they filled it up, and people were complaining too much because the pollution was so bad off here. So they quit, and that's when they moved it out to Kaneohe side, and they shut this down and just left it sitting there for about another 15 years while I tried to figure out what to do with it. As the population, especially in this part of town, started to grow up and it became more sort of upscale, there were huge complaints about the dump, this now abandoned dump, and the smells and everything. And what they decided to do in a rather impressive way is they went and actually covered it in gravel, then covered it in compost, and then built the park on top. If you go through the park, I'm sure it will show up at this level. As you walk through the park, every once in a while, you see these white pipes sticking up out of the ground. If you get really near to them, they really stink. They smell like a real bad foot. And that's because what they are is methanes. That's actually the gas that's coming out from the garbage that's underground. They've got a series of pipes to evacuate. Otherwise, they eventually would catch fire and blow up, which would be pretty cool. Waterfront parks, and it goes up in a ball of flame or something. So they avoid that. So they've actually turned this into a nice municipal park covering over a garbage dump. It cost a fair amount of money, not as much as it could have. So there are ways that you can actually deal with this type of stuff, but it's very tricky, very labor intensive, and oftentimes very, very complicated, especially if you're familiar with any place that used to be, for example, a gas station. Because what you get there is, again, you get large amounts of petrochemicals sink into the concrete, into the soil. You get things like brake fluid when you guys are repairing brakes on cars, all that sinks into the soil. And basically that whole area becomes toxic, and in today's world, you're not allowed to walk on that, and you're not allowed to breathe it. So you can't put a house or something on it, which if you've never noticed, if you go down neighborhoods, you might find a place where used to be a gas station 10 years ago and it's still an open lot. That's because they have to turn over the soil and allow that to air out to get rid of most of the toxic hydrocarbons in the soil before they can turn into something else. There's a location on King Street near where the Ross's store is, which was basically there for 20 years. It was a combination of a gas station, and part of that had been a dry cleaning establishment. It took over 20 years of recycling the dirt and the rocks. They're just now finally putting something up there. So a lot of this stuff, again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, is when you make these changes, a lot of the times they're pretty much irrevocable. The change is going to be there pretty much forever. So when you decide, okay, we're going to build a landfill here, you basically have written off that chunk of real estate for any other use for a huge amount of time, and you have all sorts of environmental consequences above and beyond, just this piece of real estate. You also have, what does it do to the water out here? There's still problems with seepage of toxic chemicals over at this side. It's a huge problem. On islands, it's more visible, but the problem's actually as bad or not worse in places like, for example, the American West. Remember that Colorado River video you saw? Well, one of the side effects of that, there's a huge amount of dumps near the Colorado River, and when it does rain, all of those runoffs and toxic chemicals, which aren't at all controlled, go into that same Colorado River, which is being used for drinking water and is also lower every year. So you can imagine going into one of those big reservoir lakes like Lake Mead. There's part of that thing that probably is almost like a toxic waste dump because of all the petrochemicals and stuff that have washed into there from upriver that have ended up sitting in that basin. And they just stay there until someone pumps them out and drinks them, basically, for all intents and purposes. So the whole issue of pollution, landfills, how do you do this efficiently? What do you make recyclable? Is recyclable really a useful model, or is it just something that in some cases people use because it makes them feel better without really having to address the issue, which is actually consumption? You know, it's part of a very complicated process. And again, as I mentioned before, if you really want to see this, take a look at articles related to like carbon footprints, which are probably the way that we use now to measure this. How much energy does it take, for example, to recycle something? There's actually a lot of data on this. There's been a lot of work done on it. But what you end up with is, for example, well, a good example would be if you go to Japan or if you go to China. If you go into a butcher shop, you're going to buy some meat, or you go into a bakery, what you're going to find is invariably they give you the merchandise. So they give you, you know, some hamburger, or they give you a pork chop, or else they give you, you know, some baked goods. And they wrap them in a piece of paper, and you take that home. If you think when you guys go to Foodland or Times or some other grocery store here in the United States, if you buy some hamburger, it'll have a foam bottom, it'll be covered in plastic on top. And then oftentimes it'll be put in some sort of a container. So what you find in the United States is you've got two or three levels of wrapping, none of which is particularly recyclable, all of which cost a lot of petrochemicals to do something that you don't need, except Americans don't think it's sanitary unless it's covered in plastic. So what you've got is the perceptual behavioral attitude that requires the recycling. You have to change the attitude about what condition you expect to see things in. Now I would point out, for example, in Asia, it's very true in Japan, if you tried to sell things like hamburger in a package with plastic on top, people won't buy it. Because if they can't see what the meat looks like, if they can't smell it, they're not going to touch it. They're very suspicious of things that are packaged because in their view, you package things to hide what the condition is. So if they go, and you can actually see this, if you go to some place like Don Quixote's where I do my shopping, which has a huge Korean, Japanese audience there, you'll see the ladies actually poking the meat packages because they don't trust them. They'll sit there and they'll hold them up to the light and they'll turn around, you know, you think they're looking like diamonds or something like that. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to figure out if it's any good because they don't trust it. So they'll very frequently go to the butcher in the back and get exactly the same meat from him because they can see him turn it into hamburger. They won't buy it. Now the Howley customers there immediately go and grab the stuff in the package. They don't want a butcher to touch it. They want a nice package wrapped in plastic piece of hamburger. Very different perceptions of what is food, but they make huge difference in terms of recycling. In the Japanese or Chinese case, it's a piece of wax paper which recycles very easily. In the American case, you got petrochemicals and long-term polymers. So a lot of this stuff is behavioral in the idea of things like packaging, which again varies tremendously from society to society. Okay. The last really big thing I want to cover today is Marx. Back in the 1830s, 1840s, there were two economic historians. I'm not sure what an economic historian actually does, but anyways, a guy named Marx and another guy named Engels. What they were looking at is the changing way in which things were made globally, but it's largely particularly Europe since they were both German. Now, part of what they came up with in terms of their analysis is still in common use today. In fact, the terms are the norm. But they also were sort of interested because since they were looking at history, they were looking at changes in time. So they're looking at the different ways that people made stuff and how much they made and how hard it was and what the technology was and how that changed over, you know, like thousands of years. It so happened that the Europe they were working in, which was the Europe of the 1830s, 1840s, was probably one of the most dramatically variable parts of time in European history. Not so much the Napoleonic period, but the 1830s, 1840s, you know, about half of the countries in Europe either showed up. Belgium, for example, shows up then. So a lot of the countries we think of as European countries now show up in that period. Enormous numbers of countries lost their kings or other political systems changed, economic system changed. So it was very much like the 2010 to 2020 period. You had huge amounts of change happening. And of course, as historians, they weren't only supposed to explain the past, they were supposed to explain the present. So we'll see Marx and Engels again later when we look at politics. But for our purposes now, there's a really key concept they came up with, which is a good one because one, it's elegant, so it's simple. And two, it's really good at explaining things. But probably best is what it actually does is it gives you a real good idea of the process that takes place when something is made. And so Marx and Engels pointed out that because people have done this before, they just screwed it up, made it complicated. They said, no, when you actually look at the production of something, so this doesn't work for well at all because I can't show you, I can't do a demo on anything because I don't got nothing to show you because you can't see me. Let's see. I was looking around trying to think of something I can use as an example. Oh, okay. Let's use a water bottle. Okay, so water bottle. So Marx and Engels said when you look at a bottle of water, you've actually got two parts to that. The first they called labor. Labor is the actual energy cost for the process of turning whatever you originally start with to a bottle of water that Madison buys at 7-Eleven or something like that. So it's all the energy cost for all of the production process. The second term was production. Production is the process of converting things from their original forms into that bottled water she's going to buy. So what do you need to make bottled water? I mean, in its final form, you need two things. What's a bottle of water have? This is like a Tuesday afternoon question. So it's real simple.
A bottle and water.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, 10 points. Yeah, you need a bottle and you need water. Okay. Now, if you're going to put the two together and end up with bottled water, and you're going to have it at the 7-Eleven across the street. Okay. Now, where does the water come from? Don't get technical here again. This is a Tuesday afternoon question. Let's say it's local bottled water. What does the company do? They just walk over to a faucet somewhere, turn the faucet on, put the water in the bottle. And you have to remember, most bottled water you drink is just tap water. It's exactly the same. It's just in a bottle for you. So that's the water part of it. Where's the bottle originally come from? Do you mine bottles in Nevada? Do you have bottle mines? Actually, if you wanted to sucker someone who was really dumb, you could probably tell them, yeah, for 10,000 bucks, I'll give you, 20% of my mine in bottled water mines. But no, unfortunately, you might make money out of them, but we won't go there. Where's the bottle come from?
Plastic.
Huh?
You get plastic and then
I can't hear. My speaker's all screwed up here. You have to speak a little louder.
you get plastic or you make plastic and then you make the bottle.
Okay, yeah. You squeeze it out of plastics in a mold. Where does the plastic come from? Do you have plastic mines? Ooh, that would be good money. I'm sure I could talk people on that one.
The petroleum.
Yeah, it's oil. So if you would, you get plastic from Saudi Arabia in the terms of oil. Under heat and pressure, you turn that into plastics. And then, like Kayla said, you then mold those into the bottle. Okay? So if you go back to the original form, the two parts that make that up are, one is the water's coming from, we'll just say, the ground. The plastic is originally coming up in the form of oil or petroleum out of the planet. Now, so production is the process of converting both of those from the original forms into the bottled water that Madison's going to pick up at 7-Eleven. Okay? Now, what's the energy cost in all that there? And that's sort of tricky. Is there any energy cost in the water? Actually, there is. Not a huge amount. But if there was no energy cost, how would you collect the water? Which you could do, I suppose. It'd be pretty gross.
Go to the ocean.
Yeah, you can, well, I don't know if I'd use ocean water, but yeah, you can just walk over to Palolo Stream, stick the bottle in, and then just cork it up. Or even better, go down the olive line, and you could call it, mineral water or something. So yeah, so I mean, that would be the way. But the fact is, since you're getting it from a faucet, that means the Board of Water Supply pumped that water out of the ground, they put it in the water system, and you turn your faucet on, it ends up in the bottle. So there's actually some labor cost there because you have to have people putting the wells in, you have to have people maintaining the water system, keeping the pressure up, pipe systems, all that stuff. So it's not quite free. What's the energy cost of the bottle? And we'll say hypothetically, Peyton's exactly right. So it comes from oil. We'll say it's, for some reason, it's Saudi Arabian oil. I don't know why. So if you start with the oil in Saudi Arabia, you have to do what?
You have to ship it.
Yeah, you have to ship it somewhere where then you have to put it in a plant under enormous amounts of heat, turn it into plastic. Those are usually little tiny, look like BBs or pellets. You then take it to another plant in another part of the world, which then squeezes that into a plastic, which makes it into parts of the bottle. But the bottle is usually separate from the cap. So then you have to take it to another place, maybe here, where they buy all these empty bottles and then they sit there and put water and put the cap on top. So you not only have the actual conversion from oil to plastics, but you've also shipped it at least 5 or 6 times from other parts of the world to other parts of the world to end up with a bottle of water that you buy at, say, at 7-Eleven. Now, that production cost then is actually quite complicated and actually takes an enormous amount of energy to just have a bottle of water that you very conveniently pop the top in a couple of seconds if you're thirsty. You drink the whole thing and you throw it away. And this is one of the things that people don't really understand. This is why the word production is such an absolutely important concept. If you understand the process of production, when you're looking at something you consume, especially stuff we consume and throw away, you think of something really scary, like say a health food bar, like an energy bar. There's all the ingredients to make that up, and I have no idea. Probably some of it's probably minerals, but you have all the stuff that makes up the actual bar that you eat. But you also have, again, the petrochemicals and other stuff that turn into the wrapping that provides the candy wrapper that you throw away with very little thought attached to it. So and those all have to be shipped all around the planet. So if you actually look at production is really scary. If you go into some place like Costco and you actually just sit there and look at something for a second and think of the production cost for that to end up at the, say, the Ivale Kalihi Costco store. And you can especially think of things, say a whole pallet of water. It can sort of freak you out because you realize that you've actually spent an enormous amount of energy to provide something that people think of as a convenience. That in a weird way, when you think about it, 20 years ago, bottled water didn't exist. Bottled water has only existed since you guys were in grade school. And prior to that, it never occurred to people to drink water out of a bottle. You got water from a tap. You might have a thermos or a container for water, but you didn't buy throwaway bottles of water. That's a 21st century thing and largely in the last decade. There's an enormous amount of energy used in the process of something that we see as a throwaway item. Use it once, toss it, forget it. And that's one reason why that landfill has gotten so full so fast, is because we've become so disassociated from production that we don't understand it. Now, if you go back, say, a couple of 100 years ago, and you're living in the back here in Palolo Valley, and you're a farmer in the Hawaiian period, if you want a plate to eat your food on, that's literally going out and you go over to the challah tree or you go over to the tea plant and you weave that plate out of those fronds. If you want the food, you pick the crop out of the ground, you cook it yourself on wood that you picked up and made a fire of it. So in that particular situation, labor and production costs were very intimate with consumption. People had a very good idea of what it cost to make something because they made it themselves or else they were involved in the process. Now it's entirely mindless. If you go to 7-Eleven or say Long's or something like that, it would be almost impossible unless you actually think about it to actually visualize the production and the labor cost in that particular item. Till you realize that that's actually really scary that you don't know, because what it means is you have no control over the impacts that you're making environmentally in terms of really sort of casual choices that you're just not even thinking about. Oh, I'm thirsty, I'm gonna get a bottle of water. So it's labor and production are absolutely critical, especially if you're trying to look at limited environmental resources, how do you protect the planet and such like that. You need to understand, especially production, because all of a sudden what you look around you, especially in what we call convenience foods, is really sort of surreal. And a good example would be, if you think about it for a second, again, I think I mentioned this before, if you're buying hamburgers from McDonald's, like the one down here on Wylam, most of that raw beef or the hamburger meat is actually originally from Brazil, which means it's shipped to the mainland, processed into hamburger, and then shipped out here to Hawaii. So it's probably gone about 7,000 miles to get here. So that, that process of consumption is a very, very long thing for you to end up with a convenient, Big Mac with fries. So production and labor are really, really important concepts when you're looking at this whole idea of how things are and how things, are set up. I lost everyone here, but so. What happened here? Okay. Yeah, okay, I'll explain a little bit of outsourcing. Outsourcing seems sort of pretty self-explanatory too. We're actually a really good example of outsourcing here. Outsourcing is where you find that in many companies, their major cost, especially nowadays, is considered to be the cost of labor. So as somebody noted when we were looking at the earlier stuff, is that if you can reduce labor cost, then you're oftentimes the word you use is more competitive, but actually in reality, what you usually find out is you make more money as your company, because your labor costs are the major part of what you do. For example, here at Chaminade, labor costs are probably a huge part of what costs the university because they got to pay people like me. So what you find is if you end up in a competitive industry, or if you end up in an industry, there's a lot of pressure where, say, the people that own the company want to make more money. One of the ways that you do that is you find a cheaper place to do the labor. Now, traditionally that was really difficult, but all of a sudden with the internet, especially in the last 30 years or so, the internet's become very robust. Now it's real easy to do. If you want to see this classically, if you call up Hawaiian Airlines, if and when they start back up in business, and you try to figure out, where you want to go. So you're talking to someone that's on their, reservations desk. On the reservations desk used to be here in Honolulu. And they moved it out in the 1990s, they moved it to Manila. So now if you're talking to someone at the reservations desk, they're actually in the Philippines. Because with telecommunications, the cost was the same in terms of the phone call. But now they could pay someone in the Philippines basically about 1/10 what they paid the same person here in Honolulu. So all of a sudden the people here get let go and Manila ends up with a new company. Outsourcing is a huge part of how we do things in the 21st century. It's become a very contentious one because the places that lose the jobs obviously get very upset. The places that gain the jobs love it. So outsourcing is one of those things that you'll see a lot brought up in the media. Interesting how the same changes with COVID, I'm not particularly sure. Let's see. I want to wait on production migration because I want to send you guys a video to watch before I show you that. Same with remittances. Okay, why don't we call it a halt with that? I'll cover this stuff next time because I don't want to get too far into that before I show you a couple of videos and I'll give you a better idea of what, sort of illustrations of some of the stuff. Is there any questions on the stuff that I covered today? Probably not. It's pretty straightforward. It's more the implications it really is than actually discussion.